Chronic or long-term stress can weaken your immune system in many ways. So today, I'm going to talk about how that happens. And it might surprise you because it's not what you think. I'm an ENT surgeon and sleep medicine doctor. I'm an ENT surgeon and sleep medicine doctor. And this is part of our series on sleep for health professionals. The overall goal of this series is to help you understand how sleep impacts every organ system in the body, so you can use sleep as a tool to optimize your patient's health. This week, we're talking about the immune system. The most common way that people think about stress is through the release of adrenaline and cortisol from the adrenal glands. And those hormones are released when we perceive a threat, and they help us fight or flight. When those hormones are released acutely or in short bursts, that's a good thing. But when we have chronic stress where those hormones are elevated all the time, that's when it becomes a problem. So let's first talk about cortisol. Cortisol is what we call a glucocorticoid, which means it helps regulate glucose metabolism. It also has a very potent anti-inflammatory effect in the body. That's why cortisol is one of the main hormones that we use in medicine to control inflammation in autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. The problem is when we have chronically elevated cortisol levels. In medicine, we often see patients who have a tumor in the adrenal gland that produces too much cortisol. And these patients often present with what we call Cushing's syndrome. And Cushing's syndrome is associated with a number of problems. One of them is a loss of appetite and weight loss, but also an increase in belly fat. So patients will typically look like they have a moon face. So their face will be round and full. They may also have buffalo hump, where there's an accumulation of fat in the upper back. Also, these patients are very susceptible to infections. And even if they do get an infection, they won't be able to fight it off very well. So they may even get an infection and not know it. They may have vague symptoms like fatigue, but they won't really feel that sick until the infection becomes really severe. So, for example, they may get pneumonia because they didn't fight off the initial infection, and then that can lead to sepsis and even death. So this is how chronically elevated levels of cortisol can be dangerous. When we're talking about stress, cortisol is definitely a major player, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But I want to point out that there are other hormones involved in our response to stress as well. There's growth hormone, there's thyroid-stimulating hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, antithyroid hormone, and also vasopressin. But in this video, we're going to focus primarily on cortisol. Alright, so cortisol, how does it work? Cortisol is made in the adrenal gland, but actually it starts out as a molecule called cholesterol that comes from the precursor molecule acetate. Acetate is a molecule that our cells can use to make energy. It can either be used directly by the mitochondria to make ATP, or it can be stored in the form of fat. Cortisol takes about 12 steps to make from this cholesterol precursor, and each step is catalyzed by an enzyme. And there are certain genes in our DNA that code for those enzymes. So cortisol production is controlled by both the availability of the cholesterol substrate, but also how active those genes are that code for the different enzymes needed to convert cholesterol to cortisol. When we're exposed to stress, the hypothalamus in the brain releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH goes through the bloodstream to the pituitary gland and stimulates the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH then travels through the blood to the adrenal glands and stimulates cortisol release from the adrenal glands. Now, cortisol, once released, can then bind to a receptor in almost every cell in the body, but especially in the liver, muscle, fat, bone, the immune cells, and the brain. Once cortisol binds to its receptor, it enters the nucleus of the cell, and then it can affect gene transcription. So it can turn genes on or off, and that can change the behavior of the cell. In particular, cortisol binding to its receptor creates a complex that binds to a molecule called an importin. and importin allows cortisol to enter the nucleus of the cell and affect gene transcription. In the case of immune cells, the presence of cortisol suppresses certain genes that are important for the immune response. So, in particular, there are two proteins called I-kappa B alpha and I-kappa B beta. And these two proteins normally inhibit another protein called NFKB. NFKB is kind of like a transcription factor that turns on genes related to the immune response. So when cortisol is high, then I-kappa B alpha and beta are present in high amounts and they keep NFKB inactive. So basically, when cortisol is high, you don't get the immune response. Now, the other mechanism by which cortisol affects the immune system is by inducing apoptosis or programmed cell death. So, for example, cortisol is known to cause apoptosis in T cells, B cells, natural killer cells, macrophages, and even stem cells that replenish the immune system. So, again, that's another way that cortisol, when it's elevated, can weaken the immune system. You might be wondering, how does cortisol affect the sleep system? Well, cortisol has a half-life of about 10 to 20 minutes. So cortisol that's released late at night will be mostly cleared by the time you try to go to sleep. However, cortisol receptors are present in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the pacemaker for our circadian rhythm. So cortisol binding to the suprachiasmatic nucleus can reset the circadian rhythm. In addition, cortisol receptors are present in the pontine and the ventrolateral preoptic nuclei, which are areas of the brain that promote wakefulness. So if cortisol is elevated, it can block the effects of those areas that promote sleep. And lastly, cortisol receptors are also found in the reticular activating system. And this is a collection of neurons in the brainstem that modulate sensory input to the cortex. And so when cortisol binds to those receptors, it reduces activity in the reticular activating system, and that promotes sleep. All right, so we just talked about how cortisol can weaken the immune system. But what about exercise, meditation, hobbies, things like that? How can those things counter the effects of cortisol? Well, those things reduce the perception of the stressor. They also reduce CRH release from the hypothalamus, and that in turn reduces the downstream effects on the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland. Those things can also increase the amount of negative feedback from the adrenal gland to the pituitary gland. So there's a molecule called cortisol-binding globulin that's made by the liver, and when cortisol binds to that protein, it makes the cortisol less active. So there's a dynamic equilibrium between free cortisol and cortisol bound to cortisol-binding globulin. And exercise, meditation, hobbies, etc. can increase the amount of cortisol-binding globulin and thus decrease the amount of free cortisol. Lastly, exercise, meditation, hobbies, etc. can increase the amount of endorphins in the body, and endorphins bind to the same receptors as opioids, and opioids are known to dampen the immune response. So endorphins can have a similar effect. Okay, now we've talked a lot about how chronic stress weakens the immune system, but what about sleep? How does sleep counteract the effects of chronic stress on the immune system? Well, during sleep, we have increased levels of something called integrin. And this molecule is important for communication between immune cells. So when we're awake, integrin is internalized within the cell. But when we sleep, it moves to the surface of the cell, and that increases communication between immune cells. In addition, during sleep, there's increased levels of interleukin-2 and interleukin-7. These are molecules that stimulate the growth and activation of immune cells. And lastly, during sleep, there's increased amounts of something called killer immunoglobulin-like receptors, which are receptors that recognize stressed cells or virus-infected cells. So all of these changes during sleep help to rebuild our immune strength. There's also some interesting data in mice that show that the immune system can actually sense danger signals from infected cells during sleep. These danger signals are called damage-associated molecular patterns. And the organs that contain the highest numbers of immune cells actually concentrate the most damage-associated molecular patterns during sleep. And that leads to a more robust immune response. In my practice, I see a lot of patients who have obstructive sleep apnea. And if you're not familiar with obstructive sleep apnea, it's when someone stops breathing during sleep because their airway is blocked by overly relaxed airway muscles. As a result, these patients have very poor sleep quality despite sleeping 8 or more hours a night. After treating their sleep apnea, I often see improvements in their immune function. For example, I see fewer sinus and ear infections. And that could be because treatment of their sleep apnea results in better sleep quality and thus improved immune function. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you found it useful. If you did, please consider subscribing. Also, we've created some resources for you to share with your patients to help them learn more about sleep. You can find those links below. As always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.